Let me welcome you all to the annual lecture series in the Centre for Philosophy of Science. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, and it really is a pleasure because I'm expecting something wonderful. I'll explain why in a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about Frances Egan. She has bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Manitoba and a PhD from Western. She's much travelled and has had visiting appointments at the Royal University of Bochum, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and at the University of Bielefeld. She is a professor of philosophy at Rutgers University and a member of the Rutgers University Centre for Cognitive Science. She works in philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, and the foundations of cognitive science. And she comes to us as a representative of what surely has to be the leading centre in the world for people who think about this sort of stuff, right? And so you're bringing us very great wisdom from the East Coast to what I think of as a minor provincial centre in this sort of thinking. And you're all thinking, true of me. Okay, yes, true of me. And so I'm actually looking forward to what you're going to be talking about, because I am, I admit, a member of the folk. And as a member of the folk, I just think that mental states represent. And I don't really know what that means, but I'm encouraged in that belief by knowing that neuroscientists say this, right? But I'm also... They
say it, but...
Well, that's the thing. And then as a philosopher, I kind of worry, because I know that I don't know what I mean, and I suspect they don't know either, so I need therapy. And I think you're going to provide that.
I may provide a little bit of that, I hope.
I hope that's what you can do today, so please, help me.
Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's the first talk I've ever given here. I've been in this building many times, but it's nice to be on the side of the audience. Okay, so much of cognitive neuroscience seems to construe our cognitive processes as involving representation in some way. Can you hear me? Is this...
Yeah.
So theorists of vision, for example, often posit structures that are said to represent edges in the world. Neurons are said to represent elements of their receptive fields. But I think that despite widespread use of representational talk in cognitive neuroscience and computational psychology, there isn't a consensus on how to understand this talk. So one question is whether it should be construed literally. Should one be realist about such talk? Is it fully committed? Another proposal is that we should be fictionalists about such talk. I think both of these views are wrong, so I want to argue for a different view. I call the view that I'm promoting a deflationary account of representation. I'll say what that means shortly. Okay, so I've got two aims in this talk. One is to explicate the role that representation plays in the sciences that aim to explain our cognitive capacities, in particular in computational cognitive psychology and computational neuroscience. And then I want to argue that neither a realist nor a fictionalist interpretation of representational talk is appropriate. I call the right interpretation deflationary. So I want to start by trying to get a fix on this notion of representation. What do we mean by it? The central examples are all public instances of public representations. So for example, utterances, written texts, maps, photographs, drawings, pie charts, graphs, and so on. Now central to all of these examples is a distinction between the representational vehicle, which is a physically realized thing that has causal powers, like the sounds that I'm making, or like marks on the page, and so on. So on the one hand, and then the content, the meaning, the information conveyed, the message, the information, and so on. So content isn't just free-floating. It's anchored to or carried by vehicles. And another feature of kind of all the standard examples of representations is that they have content, they have vehicles, they have content. So having vehicles, they have causes. They have causes and effects in the world. And they also carry some information. So contents entail correctness conditions. So representations are capable of misrepresenting. For example, a photograph will misrepresent Jack being taller than Jill if he happens to be standing on a box. If the labels on a map, the labels Pittsburgh and New York are switched, then the map will misrepresent Pittsburgh being east of New York. So representations, because they have contents, and contents entail correctness conditions, the content can either be true or accurate or not, then representations are capable of misrepresenting. So unless mental representations or internal representations are enough like these standard examples of representations, then they shouldn't count as representations. They have to have roughly these features. Obviously, there are differences between public representations and internal representations. The latter are in the head, public ones are out there. Public representations get their meaning by convention, by the intentions of speakers. That's not going to work for internal representations. They have to get their contents or meanings in some other way. Okay, so turning to mental representations, as I've said, computational neuroscientists use representational talk, but question is, should it be taken literally? Do computational models really posit internal representations? That is, things that are enough like the representations that we know and love to actually count as representations. So here's two possible answers. One is what I call robust realism. It holds that representational talk is to be taken literally. Mental representations are as real as written texts, maps, and so on. An alternative is fictionalism. Representational talk is just a useful fiction. So I'm going to argue that both of these views are wrong, but I think they're right in some respect. They're not completely wrong. So I would say that robust realism is basically right about vehicles, but wrong about content. And fictionalism is wrong about vehicles and kind of on the right track about content. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you of. So there's a third possibility, and that's what I call deflationism or deflationary account, according to which mental representations are real states or structures that are given a representational gloss. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay, so one motivation for fictionalism is the idea that computational models, as applied to human minds, or human and animal minds, are just metaphors. They're not really to be taken literally. And here's, the brain isn't actually computing according to this view. So here's Louise Barrett in her book, Beyond the Brain, How Body and Environment Shape Animal and Human Minds. She says, indeed, some people go so far as to argue that the human brain is not just analogous to a computer in a strictly metaphorical sense, but that it actually is a computer in the sense that it takes in input, processes it in various ways, and then produces a specific output. Our use of the computer metaphor is so familiar and comfortable that we sometimes forget that we're dealing only with a metaphor, and that there may be other equally interesting and perhaps more appropriate ways to think about brains and nervous systems and what they do. So according to Barrett, brains don't really compute. This view is fairly common, actually. Hacker and Bennett, in their philosophical foundations of neuroscience, advocate basically the same idea. They don't think that brains compute. Or rather, they actually say that computers don't calculate. But the important point is that computers and brains are not doing the same thing. However you want to characterize what each is doing, they're not doing the same thing. Okay, so a computational description might be a metaphor. I don't want to deny I don't want to claim that this view is always wrong, not to be taken as a literal description of the brain. A realist or literal interpretation of a computational model is not always appropriate. For example, some Bayesian theorists, including some of my colleagues in the psychology department at Rutgers, claim that their models are intended merely to systematize and predict behavior, not to describe how the brain actually works. But if the purpose is to explain a cognitive capacity, that is to explain how the brain actually does it, then a metaphor isn't going to do the job. So generally, the metaphor view is mistaken as an account of computational models. That's what I'm claiming. A computational model that characterizes a neural system as computing integration or vector subtraction, for example, purports to literally describe neural processes. The brain computes the specified function in the same sense as a hand calculator or an iPad does. Now, to be sure, computational characterization involves idealization, but a computational description of a neural system involves no more idealization than a computational description of any other physical system. So, for example, a hand calculator, its computing capacity is limited by the size of the display. And humans have memory limitations and other sorts of limitations. So to say that we compute the addition function, it's idealizing, it's abstracting away from some of our limitations. But that's true of computers as well as us, true of any physical system. So despite the idealization, the computational characterization is intended to be literally true of both the brain and the calculator. And the explanatory role of these models depends on this. If it's just a metaphor, then there's no explanation. Okay, a couple of caveats. At an early stage, the model might be just a hypothesis without much empirical confirmation. We might not know how it's realized in the brain. At this point, it might be the merest of a mechanism sketch. But it's a hypothesis about what the brain is actually doing. So I'm claiming that a literal interpretation is appropriate. Now I'm talking here, I haven't said anything about representation. I'm talking here about computation. So I'm saying that computational models, insofar as they're offered as explanations of what we're doing, when animals like ourselves are doing when we achieve a cognitive capacity, that they're to be taken literally. And another caveat. There's always a question about how much of an empirical theory should be interpreted realistically and how much should be construed simply as a feature of the representational scheme used to articulate the theory. But my point is that computational models aim to characterize how neural systems actually compute, though some of the details at a given point in inquiry will not yet be specified. So the question then is, what is it for a physical system to compute a function? So I want to spell this out by using a simple example. Most generally, a physical system computes the addition function just in case there's a mapping from physical states, these P's at the bottom, physical states down here, to numbers such that when the system's in the physical state, P1 and P2, that's mapped to numbers N and M, it's caused to go into the physical state to some other physical state that's, according to the mapping, the sum of N and M. So any physical system computes the addition function just in case there is this kind of mapping. Let me say a little bit more about this diagram. This bottom arrow here, this is a causal. I'm having trouble finding this thing. Can you see anyway, the bottom arrow is a causal arrow. So when it's in physical states P1 and P2, it goes in, it's caused to go into P3. The top arrow is just indicating the arguments and values of the function, in this case addition. And I'm going to say a little bit more about how to understand the vertical arrows in a minute. Okay, so that's just what it is for a physical system, a brain, a hand calculator, your iPad, whatever, to compute the addition function. Now, computational descriptions are abstract, in a sense that I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, but they're not or needn't be fictions. A computational description is an abstract characterization of the causal organization underlying a cognitive capacity. So what do I mean by abstract? Well, I need a number of things, but most importantly, the description is going to abstract away from some of the physical detail. Not all of the physical detail at the bottom level is going to be relevant for understanding what the system's doing, for understanding, in this case, how it adds. Computational models characterize the causal organization of the system by specifying the function in the mathematical sense that the system computes. This is at the top level of my diagram. And then in a fully articulated computational model of a human cognitive capacity, it specifies the neural states that realize the arguments and values of the function. And that's the bottom level, the physical level. So again, the diagram. So the relevant causal organization of the system, and by relevant here I mean in virtue of which it can add. This system can maybe do all kinds of things. If it's us, then obviously it can. The bottom level characterizes the causal organization that's relevant for addition, and then maps it to the function. So the function gives a compact and perspicuous characterization of this causal organization that's characterized at the bottom level. It's characterized in a compact way by mapping it to the computed function. So do we have representations here? Well, we could see these physical states, P1, P2, and P3, as representing the numbers to which they're mapped. That's kind of an intuitive way to see things. But if we've got a computational model of some cognitive capacity, maybe vision or motor output system or whatever, or addition actually, then, and we want to try to get to understand what are its representational commitments. Is it positing representations? Then we have to complicate the picture a little bit. So we're going to add another level, a middle level to the diagram. So now we've got two mappings. We've got a mapping at the bottom from physical states to structures of some sort, the S's. And we could think of those as numerals in this case. It's sticking with the addition example. So this bottom mapping I call a realization function. That's F sub r on the right-hand side. So the bottom mapping maps physical states to some kind of structures, and in this example, they're going to be numerals. And the top mapping is the interpretation function. And it maps these structures, they might be symbols, for example. I mean, that's left open. They're just abstractions off the physical states characterized at the bottom. And that top mapping they get interpreted. So they get assigned, in this case, numbers, addends and sums. So then the first vertical arrows that's the realization relation. The bottom one's realization, the top one's interpretation. And the straight, the solid arrows are causation, with the middle arrow being causation at a higher level of abstraction. And again, as before, the top dotted arrow just is the specification of the arguments and values of the function, in this case addition. Okay, so in summarizing, there are two mappings. What I call a realization function, which is the bottom mapping, which specifies the vehicles of representation, characterizing physical states of some sort, but abstracting away from all the messy causal detail at the bottom. And at the top, an interpretation function which specifies their content, which characterizes the meanings of the vehicles in the middle. Okay, I want to make one point about vehicles and one point about contents. We should be liberal about what counts as a vehicle. They might be discrete symbols, but they could also be, for example, characteristic patterns of activation of a network. The realization function will abstract away from some properties of the realizing physical or neural states and group them together by their role in cognitive processing. So I'm going to typically call these, the vehicles, I'm going to call them structures. Typically, I might also use states. States might be better because that's more inclusive. So it's kind of weird to talk about patterns of activation of connectionist networks as structures, but I think that the advantage there, so I'm using structure like really liberally. It's just some physical specification of some physical state. Again, abstracting away from that's a physical equivalence class that gets at just the role of what's important to the equivalence class is its role in cognitive processing. Okay, and a point about content. A computational theory takes states of the system to literally represent the arguments and values of the computed function. So our question then, is there representation here? Yes. The states of the system, the middle level states, literally represent, in the addition case, addends and sums. I call these mathematical contents, and we should be straightforwardly realist about them. So my little diagram of an adder, it represents addends and sums. The vehicles have the content, addends and sums. So then realism about both vehicles and content is appropriate here. So some more examples. Perceptual systems compute smoothing functions. So for example, David Marr hypothesizes that the early visual system computes the Laplacian of the Gaussian in extracting edges from the scene. The motor control system compute, and this is kind of not just Marr. I mean, that's what vision theorists do. They posit that perceptual systems compute various sorts of smoothing functions in eliminating noise. The motor control system computes. Motor control system takes visual and proprioceptive information and computes vector subtraction functions in enabling the organism to reach for something in its field of vision. The ocular motor system computes integration functions in keeping track of eye movements during saccades. So widespread practice, what these theories do, what theorists do is specify functions that the system computes, and those mechanisms, those systems actually represent the arguments and values of the function. So I'm saying we should be straightforwardly realist about this. This is the best way to interpret computational practice. Okay, but these really aren't the sorts of contents that philosophers at least have argued about. These aren't the controversial cases. The controversial cases involve issues about internal states representing external distal properties and objects. So, for example, the visual system is said to represent edges in the scene, and so on. So those are the interesting cases. Theorists talk of the visual system representing edges in the world, and place cells in the rat brain representing locations in the local space. That is, they talk about internal states representing external distal objects and properties. I've called these cognitive contents as opposed to mathematical contents. So I'm not going to say anything more about mathematical contents. We can talk about them more in Q&A if you like, but I want to contrast these cognitive contents with the mathematical contents, and I think that this is where the controversy is. I call them cognitive contents because they're the sorts of contents that typically get ascribed in accounts of cognitive capacities, accounts of vision, accounts of motor control, and so on. So the question then is, how are cognitive contents determined? What is it that gives an internal state the content a particular content, distal content in the world. How does something in the head represent some external object or property? And there have been lots of proposals, and most of them fit a particular model. Most of them count as naturalistic. So a naturalistic proposal for a cognitive content construes the relation between an internal structure and what it's about, the representation relation, in other words, as specifiable without reference to meanings. That would be question-begging if you're trying to give an account of mental representation, or to the intentions of theorists. So all of the proposals that I know of for how internal states get their representation that aim to be kind of responsive to the science are offering a naturalistic proposal. It should be, I mean, they're offered as reductive accounts of how something in here can mean something out there. And they all have in common that they involve some kind of tracking relation between what's going on in the head and what's going on in the world. So for example, some structure in the head tracks or covaries some distal property tokening in the world, and in virtue of that tracking or covarying, it's said to represent, this represents that. So they all have that common feature. So let me just very quickly run through some examples. Many of you will be familiar with these. Causal-based accounts, very roughly, an internal structure is said to mean X, say maybe mean edge, if it's caused by an edge. So this in here means edge if an edge out there causes this structure to be tokened in my head. So these are also called information-based accounts. Teleological accounts, on the other hand, so examples of causal-based theorists, Dretske most famously, Fred Dretske, also Jerry Fodor in his work in the 90s. Teleological accounts, the most famous proponent is Ruth Millikan, but there are lots and lots and lots of teleological theorists. David Papineau, Karen Neander, Nick Shea, many, many others. So according to these sorts of accounts, an internal structure means X, so it means edge, for example, if it has the biological function of indicating X's or edges. And a third sort of account appeals to structural similarity or homomorphism, which is the type of relation that holds between a map and the objects and properties that it represents. So these are the most popular proposals. They're all naturalistic in that they all strive to characterize this relation without any reference to intentions of theorists or public meaning or anything of that sort, because they're supposed to be explanatory of representation. They don't want to actually rely on it. But there's a problem for all naturalistic accounts of cognitive contents, and that's indeterminacy. Whatever the proposed tracking relation, it fails to pick out a unique external condition. So whatever of the previous slide, any of those proposals, even when they're fairly well, when bells and whistles are added to kind of the main point, there's still some resulting indeterminacy. The internal structure will have multiple different meanings. So let me illustrate this. I think it's most easy to point it out with respect to Jerome Letvin and collaborators' famous frog-fly example. So they asked, what does the frog's eye tell the frog's brain? So they're putting it in representational terms. What's the content of the structure in the brain that eventuates when a fly crosses the frog's visual field? So again, fly crosses the frog's visual field, it sets in motion this mechanism, the frog's tongue shoots out and catches it. When things go well, catches it. So here are some candidates for the issue is, what does that internal state in the brain of the frog represent? It represents something external. That's obvious, but what? Because there's actually kind of a lot going on, even in that simple case. So here are some candidates for content. Maybe it represents fly. because it's flies that typically trigger the mechanism in the frog's normal environment. Alternatively, maybe it represents food, because the whole point of this mechanism is to get food into the frog. Another proposal is that it represents small, dark, moving object, because any small, dark, moving object will trigger the mechanism. You lob a BB at it, and it's going to ingest it. So, teleological theorists have proposed all of these possibilities. Millikan's actually proposed at one point fly, and then another time food. So even naturalistic semanticists who basically agree on what's relevant can't seem to agree on what the specific content is. All of these have been proposed. Now we might object, well, so what? Why does indeterminacy matter? Doesn't the internal structure represent all of these things? Why do we have to pick? Why is it necessary that it represents just one of the various options? And it matters because if the structure doesn't have determinate content, then it isn't a representation. Remember back to the conditions that I claimed were essential for something in the head, something private, to count as a representation. It's got to be enough like the public cases to make that, to justify that. And I think this is non-negotiable. If it can't misrepresent, then it's not genuine representation. It's something like indication, maybe, which is not a representational relation. So recall that a characteristic feature of representations is that they can misrepresent, but if the structure doesn't have determinate contents, and hence determinate correctness conditions, then it's impossible to draw a line between a correct application and an error. So back to the content, our candidates, they all draw the line in a different place. If the structure means fly, then it misrepresents if it catches a food pellet. If the theorist in the laboratory lobs a food pellet at the frog and it catches it, that's fine, that's nutritious, but it's going to be a misrepresentation. On the other hand, if it represents food, that'll be a correct representation. And if it represents, if the preferred content is small, dark, moving object, then it accurately represents even if a BB, a little black thing is lobbed at it. So all of these proposals draw the line between a correct application and a misrepresentation in a radically different place. So which is it? But I think there's something right about the objection. The objection being, doesn't it represent all of these things? And I think what's right is that any of these contents might plausibly be attributed. There might be a rationale for attributing one rather than the other, but you can't attribute them all at once. So how to decide between them? That's the question. And my proposal is that we get determinate content only by appealing to the theorist's explanatory aims and goals. So the justification for selecting one content over the others is pragmatic. It's not going to be, that's not a naturalistic justification. It depends on what the theorist is trying to do, her explanatory aims and goals. So back to the candidates for content. How might this work? Well, if the point of the theorizing is to explain the frog's role in its kind of broader ecological niche, then that might justify saying that it's representing fly, because then you can understand the relations and interactions between different animals in the niche. On the other hand, if that's not a concern, if the concern is, say, to characterize how the frog's visual system is working, then you might go for small, dark, moving object. The theorist might say, it's representing small, dark, moving object. So it doesn't matter if it's a fly, it doesn't matter if it's a BB. Those are plausibly going to cause the same thing to happen in the visual system. Visual system doesn't distinguish between them. And so the theory shouldn't. So notice that the content selection is based on roughly on the aims of the theory, what the theorist is trying to explain. That's my proposal. So the general point is that indeterminacy of content is resolved only by reference to specific explanatory interests. That is, theorist goals and intentions, and most plausibly, collective goals and intentions of scientific communities. And once we have determinate content, we have a way of partitioning the system's responses into correct applications and mistakes. In other words, into correct representations and misrepresentations. But we can only do that by tacit appeal to pragmatic considerations. It's only pragmatic considerations that give us determinate content, appeal to the collective intentions and goals of scientific communities. So one might object, whether the brain genuinely represents or not, whether it's doing something enough like our central cases of representation to count as representation, is presumably an objective matter, not something to be determined by reference to the goals and pragmatic choices of theorists. And I would respond, despite theorists' representational talk, computational theories do not posit representations with determinate cognitive content. Okay, I put mathematical content to one side. I'm talking about these external distal contents. It is a purely objective matter. Sorry, what they posit are structures that play specific causal roles in cognitive processes, and it is a purely objective matter whether there are such structures and whether they behave in the way the theory specifies. So that's objective. Whether there are structures that the theory characterizes these structures and it's going to say how they behave, and it's objective matter whether there are such things. But still, it might be thought that my view is just flying in the face of computational practice. Theorists do talk about, they talk as if these structures have determinate contents. So how to account for that? Here's how I account for it. I claim that some of these structures are assigned content in what I call an explanatory gloss that accompanies the theory. This assigned content, and so the pragmatic elements that determine this content, is not in the theory, but it's quarantined in the explanatory gloss. So this idea of quarantining the contents and the pragmatic considerations that determine the contents, I mean, most importantly, the pragmatic elements are quarantined in the gloss. And so the naturalistic credentials of the theory are not impugned. The theory itself is characterizing the structures and mechanisms. The content that's subject to pragmatic considerations is off to the side and quarantined in what I call the explanatory gloss. So I'm appealing to a distinction then between what I call the theory proper and the explanatory gloss that includes representational contents, cognitive contents. So let me say a little bit more about this distinction. Yeah, so determinate cognitive content, a necessary condition for a structure to count as a representation, is in the gloss. So let me say what's in the theory proper. It includes the mathematical functions computed by the mechanism, as I've explained. So again, vision theories posit that the visual system computes smoothing functions. Motor control theory might say that the motor control system computes vector subtraction or something. Integration is involved in lots of different cognitive processes. So those functions are part of the mathematical functions, and hence mathematical content. Remember, I'm saying that these functions, they determine mathematical content. The mechanism just represents the arguments and values of the function. So that's part of the theory proper. Secondly, the algorithms involved in the computation of the functions. The structures, thirdly, the structures that the algorithm maintains. And fourthly, the computational processes defined over these structures. And then in a fully articulated computational theory, it will specify how all these things are realized in neural hardware. That's kind of an ideal. But that would be part of the theory proper too. And finally, general facts about the organism's normal environment that explain why computing the specified mathematical function suffices in context, in the organism's normal environment, for the successful exercise of the cognitive capacity to be explained. So theorists don't just go around positing the computation of these mathematical functions, this first element. They also have to say why computing the Laplacian of a Gaussian in context allows the visual system to recover edges. So I call this last part of the theory proper the ecological component. That kind of situates this, what we might think of as kind of formally characterized mechanism in the environment in which it's successful at doing whatever it's doing, detecting edges, navigating around the space, and so on. So the first element of the theory proper and the fifth element of the theory proper make up together what David Marr called the computational theory, this top level of the theory. The top specifies the what the system's doing, and the ecological component 5 contributes to understanding why it's doing it. Why compute a smoothing function? Well, because in context it enables the visual system to detect something interesting. This exhausts the commitments of the theory. This is all that one should be realist about. Anything else is in the gloss. So let me focus on elements 3 and 4 of the theory proper. The structures that the algorithm maintains and the computational processes defined over these structures. The structures specified by element 3 are glossed as representations. That is, they're assigned contents in the explanatory gloss. And the causal processes specified by 4 are glossed as representational processes. But this is all happening in the gloss, not in what I'm calling the theory proper. Okay, some examples of explanatory glosses in science. I think they're widespread. There are lots of them. Bohr glossed the atom as a planetary system. Maxwell glossed electromagnetic phenomena like Faraday's lines of force as the movement of fluid through tubes. So in these cases, explanatory glosses play all kinds of different heuristic and pedagogical roles. I'm focusing on a particular kind of gloss. A representational gloss construes internal structures as referring to or about external objects and properties. So for example, a structure that's characterized in the theory proper might be glossed as an edge, might be attributed the content edge in the representational gloss. Okay, so what's the point of a gloss? If it's not part of the theory proper, what's it doing? So I identified 3 functions of a representational gloss. There may be more, but I think these 3 are important. One is that a cognitive theory aims to explain a capacity, a competence, like recovering the three-dimensional structure of the scene, enabling the organism to navigate, and so on. That's not a normatively neutral way of characterizing a class of behaviors. It presumes the behavior is correct, successful. A representational gloss of the posited mechanisms allows us to see an individual instance of behavior as correct or as a mistake, as accurately representing or misrepresenting its target, maybe an edge in the scene. So what the gloss is doing here is connecting the theory, which specifies how the system is working, with the pre-theoretic explanatory target, with the normatively characterized explanatory target. The normativity is not in the theory. So by attributing content to some of these structures, then we can draw a line between getting it right and getting it wrong, representing or misrepresenting. The second function is that the gloss characterizes internal structures in a way that makes clear their causal role in a process that typically extends into the environment. The content description selects what's salient in a complex causal process. We can see this in the case of the frog and the fly. So what's happening from the point where the fly crosses the frog's visual field and the tongue comes out to catch it, it's quite a bit involved. That's a complex causal process. That structures the light in certain ways. It results in certain patterns of proximal stimulation, particular one, different ones every time on the frog's retina. A lot of that detail can be glossed over. It's not, I shouldn't use gloss because I hate that word, but it's not relevant to explaining what we want explained. But it's very difficult for a causal theorist of content, for example, an information theorist of content, who claims that the content is determined by the cause, to exclude all that extra causal detail. So what causal or information theorists of content fail to see is that content involves a pragmatically motivated selection over the entire causal process. The cause is important, but not all the causal detail. And so by selecting certain aspects of that complex causal process, that allows the theorist to kind of focus in on what's interesting. Now, this is part of the gloss, remember. The theory itself, the theory proper, is going to have to appeal to all that's necessary to explain how what's going on out there results in the structure being tokened in the head. So here's a more realistic example. The discovery of place cells in the rat hippocampus in the 1970s was crucial to characterizing the mechanism underlying spatial navigation. Place cells respond to particular regions of the local environment, and neuroscientists gloss this process using representational talk. So they talk about the firing of place cells as representing locations in the rat's environment, local environment. Head direction cells respond to head direction and are said to represent head direction. What's important here is specifying the conditions to which the cell's firing is responsive and determining its role in controlling subsequent behavior. Oops. Talk of the cell's firing representing its distal stimulus conditions is a convenience that adds nothing of theoretical significance. The primary function of content description here is characterizing internal structures and states in a way that makes clear their causal role in a cognitive process. So the content description kind of gives a compact way of characterizing all this causal stuff, and the causal stuff is going to be, I mean, the theory has to tell us the conditions, this first point, the conditions to which the firing is responsive, and what happened subsequently, its role in controlling subsequent behavior. That's the responsibility of the theory, and content description kind of gives a salient way of characterizing that. Third function, the attribution of cognitive contents can also serve as a placeholder for an incompletely developed computational theory, prior to the specification of the structures and processes that make up the theory proper, and guide the search for the mechanisms underlying the capacity. So in other words, by attributing content at a very early stage of theorizing, the theorist can kind of focus attention on the explanatory target. So for example, she might say, well, there's some structures in primary visual cortex that represent edges in the world. Now, at that point, the theorist may have no clue on what those structures are. They may not be specified, but by saying at that point that there's stuff in there that represents edges. I'm kind of parroting this a little bit, but very early stage, content might play a role. Now, at this point, content isn't playing a gloss function because there's no theory to gloss. But it's still playing an important placeholder function, standing in for, ultimately, the theory proper. And at this early stage of theory development, fictionalism is the appropriate attitude to take towards representational talk. I mean, it may turn out that there aren't any structures in there that represent edges. So at this point, it's a guess. It doesn't even rise to the level of a hypothesis. It's just, okay, so we're trying to characterize how the visual system is detecting three-dimensional structure. So let's assume that there's something in there that has the content edge. But it may turn out that the real story is going to be very different. So fictionalism is appropriate very early, before you get really what I'm calling the theory proper. But fictionalism about representational talk isn't generally correct. A fully articulated theory posits structures that play specified causal roles in cognitive processes. These structures really exist. If they're assigned cognitive content in a representational gloss, then they are glossed as representations, but they're not fictions. Place cells are not fictions. So this is a deflationary. This is what I've been calling a deflationary interpretation of mental representation. The structures really exist, and they're assigned content in a gloss that serves various heuristic purposes. Okay, I want to conclude. How am I doing for time? I want to conclude by saying a little bit more to motivate this idea of an explanatory gloss, and in particular the idea that that's the function, that's what representational content is doing. So my notion of an explanatory gloss is close to what Stephen Hartman's called a story, which he claims is of utmost importance in almost all branches of actual scientific practice. Hat tip to Colin for putting me onto this work of Hartman's. So Hartman, this paper of Hartman's, he gives a detailed account of how hadron physics uses a story. But he says that the relation of a story to it, so that's his concern. But he's characterizing something very general. He says that the relation of a story to an underlying theory, the exact details, how it's going to work, depends on the concrete example in question. So here's what he says generally about a story. Excuse me. A story is a narrative told around the formalism of the model. It's neither a deductive consequence of the model nor of the underlying theory. It is, however, inspired by the underlying theory, if there is one. This is because the story takes advantage of the vocabulary of the theory and refers to some of its features. Using more general terms, the story fits the model into a larger framework, a world picture, in a non-deductive way. A story is therefore an integral part of a model. It complements the formalism. Now, I think that Colin has actually characterized really nicely kind of one of the general functions of a story, and in particular, for my account, the first function of representational content. So I'm going to quote from Colin. Scientists must not only provide interpretations of their models, which connect the mathematics to the measurable phenomena, but also stories that link the models to the questions with which their inquiries began. So Colin here is explicating Hartman's view, his account of stories. In cases where those questions originate with phenomena that are understood pre-scientifically or pre-theoretically, as cognitive capacities are, we all have a kind of a, as subjects of having these capacities, we've got a rough and ready idea of what we can do with them. A story in this technical sense must explain why a given model is relevant to the initial questions, even if sometimes the upshot is that these questions were based in confusion. So I think that's a really nice characterization of what I'm identifying as my number one function of representational content, a representational gloss, was connecting the mechanical and mathematical details of the theory with its normatively characterized explanatory target. That's a job for a theory. For a story. So let me say a little bit more about how the representational gloss functions as a story in Hartman's sense. It's the connective tissue linking the subpersonal capacities posited in the theory and the manifest personal level rational capacities that the theory attempts to explain. The gloss connects the objective computational account with the way that we see ourselves. So the theory, remember, is objective. It's just purely naturalistic, and all the pragmatic stuff is quarantined in the gloss. but it's doing the job of connecting the theory back to our normatively characterized kind of pre-theoretic understanding of these capacities. So Noam Chomsky and I agree that representational content isn't in the theory. It's rather what he calls part of the informal presentation of a computational account. But we disagree about the value of representational content. He thinks it's worthless. He thinks we should be eliminativists about it. It's only playing kind of a motivational role. It's part of informal presentation. Get rid of it. It's not really earning its keep. And I disagree with that. So Chomsky says, we should purge the sciences of the mind of normative and intentional notions. Such talk as solving a problem, making a mistake, misrepresenting, which just reflect our parochial interests, our own parochial interests, and have no place in science. I think Chomsky's right in a sense. If our representational capacities are really to be explained, naturalistically explained, then at some point such notions as representation and content are going to drop out of the picture. The theory has to discharge its debt to such notions. It's only in the gloss, again, as I've said, that the internal structures characterized by the theory have meaning and correctness conditions. And again, these are motivated by pragmatic considerations. But Chomsky's austerity is neither necessary nor appropriate. Remember, he says, purge theorizing from any normative, any intentional notions, doesn't have a place in real science. I think that's not necessary and it's not appropriate. The project is to understand our own mentality. The representational gloss characterizes computational processes in ways congruent with our common sense understanding of ourselves, ways that the theory itself eschews. It fills a kind of explanatory gap between the scientific and the manifest image, to put the point in Seller's terms. Normative notions such as correctness and mistake, notions central to our common sense understanding of ourselves, are confined to the gloss. The gloss gives us what we might think of as a rational overlay on the mathematical and mechanical processes characterized by the theory, an overlay that serves our further projects, like normative epistemology. So it's not only that it connects with kind of our common sense folky way of understanding ourselves, it's also crucial to some important philosophical projects like doing decision theory and normative epistemology and so on. So I think eliminativism about the representational gloss is not appropriate. It's got value, but the value is kind of external to the actual motivation of the theory. Maybe this way of seeing ourselves is, as Chomsky says, parochial. So what? The representational gloss helps us recover something that the fully objective theory doesn't give us, the personal perspective. And that's, I think, a job for a story in Hartman's sense. Martian scientists may have no use for the story, but again, so what? It's our science. It's not their science. They don't need the story. They may have other stories that they need. But without the story, the theory doesn't provide us with understanding of the explanatory target. And by that I mean, given our way that we understand the explanatory target kind of pre-theoretically, I mean, these are theories of ourselves. So we can't just kind of get rid of those things. We want the theory, if it's going to give us understanding of how we work, to connect with the way that we see ourselves. Content, so summarizing. Contents play complex heuristic roles in computational theories of cognitive capacities. They're for the benefit of theorists and students of cognition. They make intelligible the account of the mechanisms specified by the theory. Attributing determinate contents in the representational gloss allows us to see the organism's activity as accurate representation of the world and occasionally as misrepresentation. Normative notions such as correctness and mistake are confined to the representational gloss. It gives us what we might think of as a rational overlay on the mathematical and mechanical processes characterized by the theory, an overlay that makes contact with our common sense conception of ourselves. Our conception of ourselves as rational creatures who are usually successful given our goals, but occasionally subject to mistakes and error. So what the gloss does then is put a human face on the mechanical and mathematical processes characterized by the theory. Thank you.